Hello everybody and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex and this week we're doing the Bloomburrow gameplay level up episode. It's just about the time in the format around that 3-4 week mark where I think gameplay just starts to matter a ton. Not to say that it hasn't mattered in the previous weeks, but the edges that you're able to gain in weeks, 1, 2, 3, come a lot from just knowing the good cards, knowing the good decks. You might be drafting with some people who just don't know what those decks and cards are. You get past a lot of those good cards, your deck is just awesome, and you can kind of steamroll even with some less than great gameplay. Now, not so much the case. Very difficult to get just a busted deck every draft or every other draft, and so gameplay is really gonna be the edge that you can gain, right? Being good in the gameplay department. Like I often call out in these episodes, gameplay tends to be very underrepresented in content you might watch or listen to, just because it's very difficult to have hour-long conversations that don't get lost in audio form about gameplay, but that's what we try to do on these kind of episodes. I think the majority of Magic players, limited Magic players, have the most to gain in getting better at gameplay rather than getting better at drafting. And a little tidbit to highlight that I thought was interesting to kick off this episode is I was just, perusing some 17 land stats the other day. I was looking at top player stats to see what cards are performing better in the hands of top players. And it came across Beza, the Bounding Spring, which is the white's elemental mythic, 2 white, 4/5, that when it enters, if you have fewer lands than the opponent, you get a treasure. If you have less life than them, you gain 4 life. If you have less creatures than them, you get 2 fish tokens. If you have fewer cards in hand, you draw a card. So whatever resource you're down, you go up. And this card, while, definitely performing well in the hands of the average player, it goes up to the second most winning card in the set in the hands of top players, which I thought was very interesting, which I think just speaks to the fact that Beza is a tricky card to play, tricky card to figure out when you want to trade off, get those tokens, when you care about the life, when you should just run it out as a 4/5. It's a card that presents a lot of options, and historically, cards that present a lot of options tend to be trickier to play with, because there's just more room for you to mess it up. By the way, the number 1 winning card in the set for top players and average players is Season of Loss, just in case you were curious, but that trend of complex cards or cards that offer you a lot of decisions being better in the hands of top players, that's something that you are really able to see if you store on 17 lands looking by top players. Spellgyre is another example of this. This is the counterspell, draw spell split card. Builder's Talent is a card that I've been going on and on about for the past few weeks if you've been watching any of my draft videos. That's another card that is performing extremely well in the hands of top players and kind of not so great in the hands of the average player. So yeah, this is what we're in for today. We're going to be talking about gameplay, diving into how to play certain archetypes a bit better, tips and tricks for individual cards, and as always with these episodes, I hope that the things we talk about will make you a better and more confident limited player overall. Before we jump into the action, I do want to give my usual, there is an arena open this weekend PSA, August 17th and 18th, sealed day 1, draft day 2. These are not advertised very well by Wizards at all, so I'm just doing my small part to keep you in the loop if you like playing these competitive events. So the way that I've chosen to go about things today is we're going to look at 5 archetypes from the set, visit each one by one, talk about some general gameplay tips and thoughts overall about how you want to play with and against these archetypes. Within those archetypes, going to be talking about some individual cards, just to touch on some tips there. I was originally going to do all 10 archetypes for this episode, but as I was putting together some notes for the episode, I realized that some of the decks, like blue-white and green-red, they're pretty straightforward in how they play. Like, I didn't think there was all that much interesting to cover. And the 5 decks that I have chosen to talk about today, I think they cover a pretty wide range of strategies. So a lot of the stuff that we do cover can still be applied to the decks that I'm not explicitly going to talk about. I do have 2 big picture thoughts about gameplay in this format, just to frame things as we get into the archetypes. My first thought has to do with what I would call like the relative straightforwardness of the archetypes in Bloomburrow. And how that means that what's in your opponent's deck and their gameplay is a bit more predictable, I think, than it would be in most sets. Someone from my Discord, actually, Johnny D WSC, put it really nicely. So I'm just going to read off what they posted. They said, given the archetypes are relatively linear, and that's very true for Bloomburrow, it's much easier to envision how a given game will play out, and so there are edges to be gained by playing and sequencing accordingly. I think this is generally a level up that most good players already do, but this is where lower general complexity of the set allows for some good practice of these kind of skills, and I think that's very true. It's basically saying when your opponent plays their first 2 lands, Mountain, Swamp, you have a really good idea of what they're trying to do with the types of cards that are going to be in their deck, and because you have a good idea from that from just the beginning of the game, you get to use that information to say, okay, well, how does my deck match up against that? Am I supposed to be the beatdown? Am I supposed to be defending in this matchup? How are our cards going to interact? Maybe you've got a lot of removal spells and your opponent's playing green-white, and so you know, okay, well, they've got the potential for protection spells. They might have Crumb and Get It and Overprotect in their deck. If that's the case, you're playing against green-white that could have protection spells. You might want to consider casting removal spells on your turn a little more often, casting removal spells when they're tapped out where you don't get blown out by those kind of cards. And it could be something as simple as just thinking, okay, the opponent is playing green-white, and the game is likely going to end, or they're trying to make the game end with a mass pump spell or activating their Warden Elder. That might mean that I should be a little bit more willing to trade off my creatures so that mass pump spell isn't as effective. And this is certainly the kind of thinking that you can put into practice in any set, really. You should be putting into practice in any set, just thinking about what the opponent could have based on their color pair. But again, it's just slightly more predictable in Bloomburrow, I think, because the decks in each color pair tend to look like other decks in each color pair a little more often than in some other sets. If this is an area that you struggle with, or you just like to get better, maybe you don't think you're that bad at it, but just want some guidance in how to think about these things, when you get into every match and you see what color pair your opponent's playing, do a bit of a meta-analysis. Think, okay, what is my deck generally trying to do? What is their deck trying to do? Where do both these decks lie on the aggressive versus controlling spectrum? I think it can be easy to go into a game after you've drafted and built your deck and think, okay, I'm an aggro deck, so that's generally my plan, but then kind of skip over what the opponent's doing and not adjust right. So, for example, you might be playing green-white, and generally green-white's quite aggressive, but the matchup could be against red-black, and maybe they're on the play, and they play a 1-drop. I wouldn't say that you're the control in the matchup necessarily as the green-white deck, but you're definitely the slightly less aggressive deck. You're the deck that is a little bit better in the late game because you have your mass pump spells, can defend a little bit more because your creatures are a little bit bigger, don't want your opponent to chip damage you so that the red-black deck doesn't trigger all their cards. But then against a black-green deck, let's say, the green-white deck is definitely going to be the beatdown in the matchup. You don't really care about your opponent chip damaging you back. You just care about ending the game before they can set up their engines, before they get into a board stall. In a lot of ways, I think Bloomburrow really exemplifies that old adage of all limited decks are just some shade of mid-range deck. And certainly some decks that's more true for than not. I think your black-red deck is mostly going to be aggressive, and then your frog deck is mostly going to be trying to play to the late game. But a lot of decks are kind of in the middle, where once you get into the matchup, you want to fine-tune. You want to identify your role in the matchup. And if you're not thinking about that stuff, either consciously or subconsciously, it's going to lead to a lot of gameplay mistakes. So you got to get that foundation right. If you don't get that foundation right, and you don't enter the game with the right mindset, a lot of your choices just aren't going to make sense with what the matchup demands. And so once you've sorted out the big picture, the strategy, and how you think your deck is going to interact with your opponent's deck in the matchup, then you can narrow in a little bit and start to think about specific cards they might have based on how the game's played out and what they might be representing. But more specifically, again, going back to the predictability of the decks in this format, pretty likely to say, okay, the red-black deck is likely to have some copies of Scales of Shale, or have a bunch of cheap removal spells. And the white-green deck, well, they're going to have a mass pump spell or two in their deck somewhere, so I should plan for that kind of stuff. Against the green-blue deck, okay, well, they've got a single green mana up, and, usually there's not too much stuff in this format for a single green mana, but of course, they're playing frogs, and they have 3 frogs, so it could be Polywallop that they have up. I think preparation and anticipation is half the battle when it comes to gameplay, just knowing the options your opponents could have, the variety of things that are in the range of what might be in their hand. You don't want to be the player who just is continuously walking into things over and over and over again, even though it's pretty obvious, or at least deducible, that they could have XYZ cards because they're playing said archetypes. And it can be really tricky because the way that all of this kind of manifests when you do it wrong, or when you get it wrong, or when you make a misstep, it's usually not like, okay, well, I'm playing against black-red with my black-green deck, and I was just swinging out every single turn of the game and attacking the back, trying to race the black-red deck, and oops, they won because I forgot they were more aggressive than me. No, like most players, they know that black-red is a really aggressive deck. They're not going to act like that. They're not going to play like that. But where missteps can happen if you're not thinking about things at a certain level is realizing like a turn late, or even a game action late, just like, I shouldn't have tried to race here where I thought I was kind of stable, because the black-red deck, they are actually pretty good at racing me back because they might have Scales of Shale to give their blocker lifelink. Like I was planning just to make a good double block and then kill them on the crackback, but they had Scales of Shale, and that completely swung the race, and I wasn't thinking about that. I think if you're a decent player playing in Platinum or Diamond or Mythic, usually you're not going to be losing the game because you completely misevaluated your role, but you might lose the game, and often losses come from just that one little misstep, just that one moment of lapse of judgment, just that one time you didn't anticipate what they could have or thought about the way they were playing, the things they were representing. That's often where it really gets you. And this leads into a much bigger topic, which is deducing things based on the information your opponent's given you and kind of trying to read their hand. We actually have a guest coming on next week talking a little bit more about that, so come back next week if you want some more deets on that. But for now, I'm just going to leave you with an example of a game that I played the other day, and I think really ties into what I was talking about. So I was playing against a red-black deck, and I was a green-blue deck. The opponent's on the play, and they go swamp, no play. I go to my turn, play a forest. They go mountain, no play. And I go to my turn. And I have the option of playing a Baker's Bane duo, the 2/2 that comes in, makes a food, or Keen Eye Curator, the green-green 3-drop raccoon rare that gets bigger if you exile some number of things from graveyards. It becomes a 7/7 trample if you exile 4 different card types with it. And I'm thinking, okay, so I could play this Keen Eye Curator, get my 3/3 on board, start maybe pressuring, maybe it's a better blocker for their 3-drop if I want to block with it. Or I could play the Baker's Bane duo. And in most situations, I think I would just play the Curator. Again, sure, it's got late game value, but being a 2-mana 3/3 is also very good. But against red-black, I went, what kind of hand did the opponent keep if they're a red-black aggro deck that doesn't have a 1-drop and doesn't have a 2-drop? That probably means it has a 2-drop removal spell in it. So I chose to lead on the Baker's Bane duo instead of the Keen Eye Curator, and sure enough, they had Take Out the Trash, so I got rewarded for that. And then that leads into another branch, of course, that things you could be thinking about of, well, okay, I know my opponent's general strategy, their general plan. Note the times that they do something that doesn't line up with that, right? If the red-black deck doesn't have a 2-drop or an early creature, there must be something going on in their hand that still made them want to keep that hand. And then my second big picture point here is a little bit less prescriptive of how to improve your gameplay in this format, a little bit more of maybe a diagnosis where you might be losing some percentage points in this format, is it's a super combat heavy format. It's just all about creature combat, really, right? When to attack, when to block, when you should double block, when you should play around a trick, when you should induce your opponent to making a trick. The vast majority of missteps and mistakes that I see people make when I'm going over game logs and reviewing people's games in this format come from the combat steps. So a little bit outside the scope of this episode, this is not a creature combat level up episode per se, but this is me saying, well, if you are struggling with the gameplay in this format, you're losing a bunch, that's probably a really good place to look. Either go back, look at your gameplay logs. You kind of be surprised, I think, just how many things you notice just going back and watching your old gameplay, being like, oh wow, I definitely shouldn't have made that attack there, or I should have made this a triple block instead of a double block. But of course, if you have the opportunity to share your game log with somebody you trust, a friend, somebody on Discord, somebody on Reddit, wherever it is, I would really, really recommend it. Just get that second set of eyes, because again, like I said, so many of the mistakes I see in this format come from that combat step. So just a good place to look. All right, moving into the archetypes now. We're going to start with green-white. So just some overall thoughts on playing go-wide decks in general in any format, but definitely applies to green-white in this format. When you're playing a token-heavy deck where you've got the column A, column B style approach of here's my tokens and here's my mass pump spell, you're playing a slightly different aggressive game than, let's say, a red-white aggro deck. Whereas the red-white aggro deck really wants to make sure that it's pushing damage on turn 2, 3, 4, like every single turn of the game, it's kind of chip damaging you and then finishing you off with, a well-timed removal spell or maybe a burn spell or something. It really needs to be able to get in those early points. The green-white deck cares a lot less about that because you're just going to finish with this big pump spell. So, number one, don't be pressured into making trades early on. Don't feel like, okay, I got to get in here, and if I don't, then my aggro deck's not going to work. No, more likely than not, your deck's actually going to function a little bit better if you don't make those aggressive attacks, like you might in the red-white deck, and just chill for a little bit. Try not to trade off. You just want to amass a board and then win eventually. Now, it's great if you can get in at early damage. I'm not saying don't try to get in early damage, because it's way easier to kill them from 12 points than from 20 points. But the general strategy I have when playing these kind of green-white tokeny decks is just don't trade, don't feel too much pressure to get in. Maybe you're gaining some life with carrot cake so that you don't fall behind and your opponent's out racing you. Maybe you manage your removal in a way where they don't have good attacks with most things and you kill the things that they do have a good attack with. And you create this board stall where nobody can really get in, but then your advantage in the late game. Really, this comes down to don't feel too pressured to trade, don't feel too bad about not getting in early damage, and in in fact, try not to trade, right? You really want to keep your creatures around because the more creatures you have, the better your mass pump spell is. Something else to keep in mind when playing these decks is trying to do the math and figure out if you have 2-turn lethal of attacking all over 2 turns without a mass pump spell. Sometimes your deck is going wide enough that your opponent only has 3 creatures to your 8 creatures, and you don't actually need that +2/+1. You just go, oh wait, there are 14. If I attack them this turn, I only lose 1 creature, I deal them 8 damage, I'm going to have a bunch of creatures next turn, they're going to have 1. I can probably kill them even without that pump spell. You know, it's very easy once you've drawn your grab response to be like, ooh, okay, let's do the math, figure out if I can kill them. But it's also really good to do the math before that happens. This is something that applies to every aggro deck, of course, but it's just something that comes up a little more often when you're playing a token strategy. It's something that I picked up on from Ryan Sachs. We used to like screen share, do drafts together back in the day, and he would always be counting, do I have 2-turn lethal? Do I have 2-turn lethal? And just ingraining that in my head as somebody who wasn't thinking about that, being like, oh wait, Ryan, who, if you don't know, is just like a master of playing aggro decks, is asking himself every single turn. So just start asking yourself that every single turn, at least every single turn where it looks reasonable. You don't want to ask that when your opponent's got 4 creatures and you've got 1, right? That obviously doesn't make sense. But when you're close to being like, this could be a spot where I can attack all over multiple turns. Yeah, do the math. It really does help. It also helps you to be like, okay, well, I'm just a little bit short of pushing damage over 2 turns. Like if they had 1 fewer blockers, it would actually work. So then you know that if you draw a removal spell next turn, and let's say the board hasn't changed, they top deck a land or something, then you know, oh, that actually pushes you to go, okay, now the math actually checks out. I did the math last turn, I was a little bit short. Now I killed their 1 blocker, and now I can make that attack. If you don't do that math, you might just be like, okay, I drew a removal spell, the board's kind of stalled, I'm just gonna kind of sit here for a while, and you miss out on a little bit of an opportunity to maybe actually just kill them. All right, now let's talk about some green-white cards. Starting with the golden common, Burrowguard Mentor. This is the star creature where power and toughness are equal to the number of creatures you control. Whenever you have a card like this, that its power and toughness is set by the number of creatures you control, you always have to be careful about it in combat a little bit, because what can happen, of course, is this is a 5/5 mentor, let's just say. Your opponent blocks with 3/3, they block one of your other attacking creatures, kill something else, and then your mentor dies, right? Because it's going to be a 3/3 with 3 damage marked post-combat. So just something to watch out for when you're just doing your combat math calculations if you've got a good attack with the mentor. And of course, if you're facing green-white, something to look for, because you can see this gigantic mentor, a pretty good big mentor, and be like, I have no chance of blocking that thing. But then you realize, well, if I just block 2 other things and put some power and toughness in front of this mentor, it actually just dies post-combat. And I've actually gotten a lot of opponents over the past few days just walking into that, not really considering that their mentor is subject to getting smaller after combat. So I was just talking about how it's much easier to kill the opponent from 12 or so rather than 20 when you cast your big pump spell at the end. And 2 cards that really help get your opponent down to that life total early on are Warren Elder and Treeguard Duo. Warden Elder, of course, the 2-mana 2/2 that can pump the team for 4 mana, and Treeguard Duo, the green 3/4 that comes in and gives something +X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. I mention this because I think people kind of miss out on a little bit of early damage that they could be sending with the Warren Elder. Just having that threat of activation ability, remember, makes your opponent not really want to block in the early turns, even if they've got a 3/3 and you're attacking with a 3/3. If you've got the Elder ability up and they have no other creatures, you basically get in with your 3/3 for free. So when you're planning out your turn and you're going, okay, I want to play my 4-drop this turn, I don't actually want to activate the Warren Elder this turn. Generally, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. You don't actually need to activate the Elder. The threat of activation will be good enough so that your 3/3 has a good attack. And I see a lot of people just missing out damage because they look at their hand and go, well, I don't want to spend my turn just pumping the team, when their opponent probably wouldn't have blocked anyways. And as far as the Treeguard Duo goes, I've seen some people hold the Duo for a big attack, like they want to put it on a trampler, or they want to put it on a flyer or something. They want to play it when they've got 6 creatures out. I think it's really good just to play after you've gone 2/3 Treeguard Duo, put it on your 3/3, maybe push 6 damage. You don't need to shoot for the stars here and have it be like a lethal or close to lethal Treeguard Duo. Just getting them down to close to 10 life points really does go a long way when eventually you're going to cast that mass pump spell. Conversely though, actually with Treeguard Duo, is if the game has meandered on a little bit, the board is stalled out, both players have a lot of creatures, I tend to hold my Treeguard Duos for creatures with keywords. You know, maybe I have a Shrike Force in my deck. I have it's the 1/3 flying vigilant double strike creature. And if I just cast my Treeguard Duo on, you know, just when I draw it, maybe they'll chump with a token, maybe they'll be forced to chump with a bigger creature, like an actual card, but Is that really accomplishing that much? If it doesn't enable a good attack the next turn, probably not. So I guess what it comes down to with Tree Guard Duo is play it out early, maybe a little more often than you are now, and then play it out late a little less often than you are now. Really want that late game boost to be something impactful, not just target player sacrifices a 1/1. Next up, a thought on optimal use of Carrot Cake. So something I started doing as I played more and more Carrot Cake is just not cracking it the turn you play it if you've kept a scry on top that you like. Now, if you're tight on mana, if it's still the early game, you just want to be spending all your mana, yeah, of course, you're going to do it. You know, you're going to want to get that 1/1 on board. Likely it's going to be good for attacking and blocking, etc. But if you're in that more board stalling part of the game where spending all your mana each turn doesn't matter all that much, the 1/1 isn't going to change what the board looks like, I've really found that just getting the additional scry and not sort of, you know, quote unquote wasting it when you're scrying something to the top that you already saw on top that you like has been something that has definitely paid off. So just a note, just don't auto sack the Carrot Cake, especially because in these kind of board stalling situations, usually you are digging to something specific, right? You really, really want to find that mass pump spell. Just like many gameplay decisions, it really comes down to what is important in this game state. Is getting on board important? Is the life gain important? Is spending all my mana important? If those aren't true, then just take it easy, do it in installments. You could even sack on upkeep on a future turn. And then talking about green-white's combat tricks, Crumb and Get It and Overprotect. Crumb and Get It, of course, the single white mana +2/+2 that you can gift to food to give the creature indestructible. And Overprotect, the uncommon +3/+3 trample, hexproof, and indestructible trick. So when you've sniffed out that your opponent has one of these cards, or might have one of these cards, they attack their 2/2 into your 3/3. You're always left with the question of, should I play into it or play around the combat trick? If you've got interaction in hand, and on a future turn you think, okay, I note it, they have that combat trick in hand, I can blow them out on a future turn, great. You know, maybe you don't want to block, you want to play around it. But I found that against green-white, I do try to really block against them in the early turns, not just because, you know, they don't want to trade off like we were just talking about, but also because Crumb and Get It and Overprotect are so punishing if you just let them keep it in their hand, right? Crumb and Get It can counter a removal spell, same with Overprotect. Overprotect can push lethal out of nowhere. Whenever you're figuring out, should I play around this trick, it's always the trade-off of, do I want to get this trick out of their hand and let them kill my creature, versus can I afford to let them have this boost in tempo, right? Because when they can play Crumb and Get It on turn 4 and then play a 3-drop, that's pretty bad. Conventional wisdom kind of says, okay, block, make them use the trick, get out of their hand. But, you know, that's not always accounting for the fact that that tempo boost they got is something tangible. Like, you can't just ignore that. So there are reasons to play around these tricks, these types of tricks, early on. But I've just found more success playing into them rather than playing around them, because I think they just get worse and worse for you as the game goes on. So just like to think about, again, weigh those options. If the tempo blowout is way too bad for you, sure, you kind of have to play around them. Don't let them use them, don't block. But in a lot of spots, the next turn you go, okay, I can untap, play 2 more creatures, have a pretty good board after that. Yeah, just play into them, make them use the trick. And if you are enjoying the show so far, consider checking out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That is the #1 place you can go to support any of my content, but especially the show. Really helps the show keep on going. If you like what we're doing here, feel like you've learned something, go check it out. There's a bunch of reward tiers over there. You can go check those out, peruse, see what we have to offer. If you'd like to support the show in a non-monetary way, just subscribing to the channel on YouTube really goes a long way. So thank you so much. Let's get back to the show. All right, let's talk about black-green. Black-green in this format is just your quintessential mid-range deck. Can beat down if it needs to, but also is pretty good at grinding. And just right there, actually, I think is something to talk about, because just like I was talking about at the beginning of the show, where you can jump into a game against a red-black deck as a white-green deck and be like, okay, well, you know, I'm an aggro deck, and not realize just how aggressive the red-black deck is. I think as the black-green deck, you kind of think, okay, I'm a slower deck, I'm going to be the controlling deck versus most decks, but you face a blue-green deck that maybe has better late game than you, or a blue-black deck potentially, and you realize a little bit too late that they are actually the ones with the inevitability. Just something to think about whenever you're playing a mid-range deck in any format, and I always think about this when I'm playing black-green, like, am I the one who needs to use my 2s and my 3s and my 4s to start attacking, even though maybe they don't attack as well as like a red-black or a white-green deck does? Or do I think I have inevitability in my deck? And that's something that you need to think about before you jump into the games too. One of my problems, the issues with black-green sometimes in this format is it can have a tough time closing out the game. You might end up with just not enough good finishers, not enough good top-end cards. You get into a board stall and just like, all right, well, we're just stalled and I've got a bunch of ground creatures and they can't get through. And then if you are an aggressive deck that kind of got brick-walled by black-green, sometimes you go, okay, well, I'm never getting through on the ground anymore. Maybe my game plan should be try to deck them. You know, they've cast 2 or 3 cash grabs and cast some self-mill stuff, and there are 12 cards in their library, you're still at 20, and you go, okay, like, I think that's a reasonable path to victory. So just adjusting your game plan as the game is developed, that's another skill that's pretty important as the black-green player and as somebody facing black-green. With that in mind, when I've got Corpseberry Cultivator, which is the 1 Hybrid Golgari 2/3, that says on your combat you can forage, and when you forage you put a +1/+1 counter on the cultivator. If I'm kind of in the middle of the game and I have a cultivator but maybe multiple more in my deck, and I'm thinking, okay, how am I actually going to close this game out? It might be these cultivators. I will not choose to forage sometimes. I'll wait until I draw multiple cultivators so that each forage can contribute to, you know, putting counters on each of my cultivators, because you only have a finite number of forages generally. So I want to be able to use them where I'm putting multiple counters on my cultivators, getting multiple threats. You don't want to end up in a spot where you're like, oh, okay, I'll go in on this one cultivator, make it, maybe even get up to like a 6-power thing, and then they just kill it, and you draw your second cultivator and your third cultivator, and those are pretty much blanks at that point. Also a card that I've got a lot of questions about when you should play it, Bark Form Harvester is the 3-mana 2/3 changeling with a reach that you can pay 2 mana to put a card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. There are definitely some concerns about decking in black-green or just not having enough action to close the game like I just talked about. I don't think you want to play this card unless you're very, very low on win conditions and just big things close the game, or you think you're going to deck in like 90% of your games. Like you've got 3 or 4 cash grabs plus some Dagger Fang duos. If you don't think you're going to see the bottom of your library in most of your games, you just don't really want to be drawing a 3-mana 2/3. Because if you're not seeing the bottom of your deck, that put a card from your graveyard to the bottom, that ability doesn't actually really do anything. And again, I really want to stress, you have to be sure that you want this card, because you don't want to put it in and be like, well, I might deck sometimes. Like it's a slight concern. Because yes, when you are about to deck, Harvester is going to be like, oh, I bet exactly what I wanted to draw. But every other game that doesn't come down to decking, drawing this card in the place of some other card that this could be is generally going to make you lose more than it's going to make you win. A little trick with Cash Grab, which is the 2-mana instant mill 4 cards. You can put a permanent from among them into your hand, and if you control the squirrel or return a squirrel this way, you make a food token. So a little bit of a niche thing that's only come up once for me, but is kind of unintuitive if you haven't seen it before, is let's just say, for the sake of example here, you have no squirrels on the battlefield, no graveyard, and no food. So again, it's not going to come up all that often. But if you have a squirrel in your hand that needs to forage to have an ability, what you can do, let's take Bushy Bodyguard for example, and say you're on 6 mana, Bushy Bodyguard being the 2-mana 2/1 uncommon that has Offspring for 2 mana, and when this thing enters you can forage, and if you do, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. So what you can do is you play the Bushy Bodyguard, either Offspringed or not, and then it's going to have the forage trigger go on the stack. In response to the forage trigger, you then cast Cash Grab, right? So now you control a squirrel. Cash Grab's gonna go off. You're gonna make a food for sure. You don't have to risk it. Be like, okay, cast Cash Grab. Hope I hit a squirrel. Then play the bodyguard. No, you can just put the bodyguard in play and then cast Cash Grab, trigger on the stack, guarantee the food. Just something that comes up once in a while that, again, just might not be that intuitive. There's a similar sort of trick you can do with Fountain Port Bell, which is the single mana artifact that searches for a land put on top of your library, and you can sack the bill for a mana to draw a card. If you want the land, like say you have a 6-drop in your hand and you've drawn the bell for turn, so you've got 5 lands in play, and you know you want the land, but you would also like to draw something this turn that's not a land, what you can do is Fountain Port Bell, trigger on the stack, sack it to see if you can draw a spell, and then put the land on top. So that's, you know, a mode of the card that doesn't come up very often, but is good to know about. All right, moving on to talking about red-black. So just to start with, we're gonna talk about playing against red-black. And I've just found that I'm super conservative against red-black, because when they get to snowball, when they get to trigger their cards that care about when your opponents have lost life, it can be really, really backbreaking. But I think the red-black deck is pretty reliant on getting in those early hits. Like, it's your classic aggro deck, where if it gets to play an efficient early game, you're going to have some problems as the game goes on. But I don't think it has very good late game, unlike something like green-white, which is an aggressive deck that I think has some good late game. You might want to consider blocking versus not in the early game, but I think versus red-black, I think you just always leave something back, leave multiple things back. You want to play around a removal spell, because if they kill your one thing, you can't double block their menace creatures anymore. ultra conservative most of the time. Because I found that if you can get past the first, 5 turns of the game without them being able to get in, they don't completely just flop on the floor and it's just an easy cakewalk from there, but it's much, much more difficult for them to win. And yeah, that kind of sounds obvious, but this just ties back into what we talked about at the beginning of the episode of really respecting the matchup dynamics. And against basically anything else but another red-black deck, I think you should try to be more conservative, try to be the one blocking, not think, okay, I can race here, I can try to beat them. Scales of Shale, again, is another card that really punishes you trying to race them back. And then as the red-black player, a few cards I want to talk about here. So, Fireglass Mentor, this is the red-black uncommon. It says at the beginning of your second main phase, if an opponent lost life this turn, exile the top 2 cards of your library, choose one of them, until on turn you may play that card. This card is just a very simple thing, but I've made this mistake before. I've seen opponents make this mistake before of casting this second main phase. You gotta cast this on your first main phase if you want the effect. And it's a very reading the card explains the card situation, but this kind of template we don't see all that often. So just have it in your head. Cast this pre-combat. Cast my Fireglass Mentor pre-combat. Ravine Raider, this is the single black mana 1/1 menace that you can pump for 2 mana to give it +1/+1. My thoughts on this card are very similar to my thoughts on Warren Elder, where there's some attacks that you might go, okay, I don't really want to spend my turn pumping this Raider so it can get through their 2/3/3s or whatever, or their 2/2/2s. But you have to consider from the opponent's side too. Like, one of those 2/2s might be a Warren Elder or a valuable 2-drop, something that they don't really want to trade off. So you're not just weighing, hey, do I want to spend the mana to be able to trade with their creatures? You have to be saying, how likely are they to actually double block this thing? Now, mind you, against red black, a good player probably is going to double block a little more often than not, or want to be like, okay, I'm fine giving up my creature that I place a little bit of value on, because I don't want the red-black player to damage me. I don't want the Bloodthirst to turn on. But more likely than not doesn't mean all the time. There are going to be situations where you go, okay, you know what? I don't think they're going to block here. I can get in my free point and cast my other spells too, even if you don't have anything in hand that cares about your opponent losing life. Sometimes, of course, you just want that early damage. Thoughtstalker Warlock. This is the 3 mana 2/2 menace that thought seizes the opponent if they've lost life. Talking about this card here, but actually not talking about it specifically in red-black. If you have this card in other decks, because like I said, against red-black, most people are going to be like, I want to block, block, block. I bluff when I have this card a lot of the time. So just like I was talking about a second ago with the Ravine Raiders, thinking, well, are they actually going to want to block with that creature? I will crash my 2/2s into a 3/3, like a good 3/3, a rare 3/3, even with no trick in hand, if I've got Thoughtstalker Warlock in my hand, if I'm playing a black-green deck, let's say, because it's so much better if you get to Thoughtseize them, and I don't think they're that likely to block with their good rare. They play a Zoraline or something on turn 3, they're not going to block with that thing against your black-green deck, and then you get them. So a lot of playing black-red, and playing with Thoughtstalker Warlock in particular, is about putting yourself in your opponent's shoes, right? Asking, if I were them, would I be willing to block? Would I be willing to risk a double block into Scales of Shale at this point in the game? The way you would play the game isn't always going to line up with the way the opponent plays the game, of course. Sometimes they have information that you don't have in their hand, or just, they're a different player. They're going to be playing a little bit differently. But I think more times than not, it really does help to just try to put yourself in their shoes to figure out what their combat decisions are going to be. And then one more card here, Alania's Pathmaker, one of the few playable, decent red commons. This is the 4 mana, 3 and a red, 4/2. It's an Otter Wizard, and when it enters, exile the top card of your library. You can play that card until the end of your next turn. I think this is a card that is kind of deceptively skill testing, in that sometimes you're just supposed to let the card go, right? Sometimes you're just supposed to be like, you know what? That's a fine card to cast, but the cards in my hand are actually better. I'm going to lose the card. I'm not going to get the card advantage off the Pathmaker, which is the reason the card is pretty good. But this game isn't about value. It's about making an efficient play this turn, getting that blocker out of the way. And this comes down to really something that I find a lot of players have difficulty with, asking the question, what is this game about? Is it about tempo, or is it about value? It's almost like Who's the Beatdown, where if you misevaluate what the game is about, if you misevaluate your role as Who's the Beatdown, you're going to have some trouble, because your pretense for why you want to cast cards and why you want to take certain game actions is going to be wrong. And this is something that if you don't feel like you have a great sense of, it's something that you kind of build up an intuition of as you play a little bit more Magic, but just be thinking about it, right? It's honestly just a good question to be asking yourself as the game goes on for any game, just going like, well, currently in this game stage, just kind of, if I were to pause this game, what is this game about? Do I think it's going to go to a grind, or do I think I can close it out reasonably in the next turn or two? All right, let's talk blue-green now. So blue-green's got this issue sometimes of just wheel spinning and drawing a bunch of Pawn Prophets and Sunshower Druids and blinking a bunch of stuff, but then not actually amounting to too much, sort of in the same way as black-green, but a little bit more so even, because if you fill your deck with too many Pawn Prophets, too many of these low-impact cards, then you're just going to keep drawing them as the game goes on. So I guess a quick deck building thing that I would advise is I've been aiming for like 2 to 3 Pawn Prophets and like 2 Sunshower Druids, because you do want to draw these cards. These are very good early game cards to help you not die, to help you keep the gas flowing, hit your land drops, but you then want to transition to the late game into drawing more impactful cards, cards that can actually close out the game. And as far as the gameplay department goes there, yeah, I think you want to identify, really, when you look at your deck, when you lay it out, thinking, okay, how am I actually going to win this game? And sometimes, yeah, you do just outcard them. You blink your Pawn Prophet 5 times, and they just can't keep up. But against a similarly grindy deck, like if you're playing blue-green against, another blue-green deck, or maybe a grindy black-green deck, they might have a similar amount of grind as you do, but also better ways to close the game. So if you're facing an aggressive deck, if you're facing a red-black deck, you don't really have to worry too much about it. Just survive, you're probably going to win eventually. But the more grindy your opponent's deck is, the more I am thinking as I'm playing the game, okay, what is my direct path to victory? Like, I am specifically laying out what cards do I want to draw. And that's actually led me to play a little bit more of the card Sky Skipper Duo, which is the 5-mana 3/3 flyer that comes in and blinks something, just because it's an okay way to close the game after the board stalled out a bit. Any bit of evasion, Shoreline Looter can kind of help too. Hunter's Talent is a really good one to help give trample to some big things in a board stall. And once you've identified those things, I think you do want ways to protect them, or at very least, I have been pretty happy playing ways to protect them. So overprotect, obviously great, but I really like playing a copy of Shore Up in all of my blue-green decks, or at least my blue-green decks that might be a little bit win condition light, which is the single blue mana instant, target creature gets +1/+1 against hexproof until end of turn. And the key about Shore Up is that if you're stable on board, and they point a removal spell at something, and you've got Shore Up in your hand, well, your immediate instinct is often like, oh, they cast a removal spell, I'm gonna Shore Up. Ask yourself if you actually need to cast that Shore Up, or if it would be better to use it down the line on something that you need to close out the game. Like, for example, I've had situations where my opponent targets my Lily Splash Mentor and is stalled up board, and sure, it might be I have a few good things to blink, I've got a Sunshower Druid, I'm gaining some life, I'm making some things bigger, but ultimately, the board stalled out enough that just putting some counters on some stuff, making some things pretty big, isn't gonna get the job done. But I know I've got 2 Sky Skipper Duos in my deck. And so I go, those are actually going to be good at closing out the game on this stalled board. I should let this Lily Splash Mentor go, keep this Shore Up for when I draw my Sky Skipper Duo, and that's the thing I need to protect. When you're playing any deck with a reasonable late game, like blue-green, I think it really just helps to, as you get to turn 5 or turn 6, and you've kind of seen how the game progressed and what the matchup is like, and what kind of cards your opponent has, I think it's good to just lay out a rough plan of how you expect to win. What cards you're digging to, what the game state needs to look like. Do you want to be trading? Do you want to be stalling at the board? It all depends on the cards in your deck, of course, but just thinking about this thing is a big step towards getting there. And just like when I was talking about playing against black-green, when you're playing against blue-green, it is very reasonable to think, I might just deck them, because if they are somebody who isn't thinking about all the things I just said, I'm just gonna save my few removal spells for the cards that actually have the ability to kill me, to fly over in the air, or is that, a big trampler like the moose or something. I'm just gonna save my removal spells for those, and yeah, they can blink their Pawn Prophets all they want, but if they can't get through my board, then they're just gonna deck before I do. Not too many specifics to call out, but I do want to talk about Sticky Tongue Sentinel, the 3-mana 3/3 reach that can pick up a permanent when it enters. And I talked about this card before and all the little tricks that it can do, but I think worth mentioning again. So one thing, of course, that I know a lot of people probably have on their mind when they think of Stinky Tongue Sentinel is Hunter's Talent. Picking up Hunter's Talent is excellent, but also works just very well with most of the classes, or at least any of the classes that haven't entered the battlefield effect. It's easy to gloss over this card's text as pick up a creature, but it is pick up a permanent. Also means that you can pick up lands if you need double pips and you've only got 1 blue source, for example. So let's just say on turn 6, you've got Island and a bunch of forests. You can tap the island, tap 3 lands, play the Sentinel, pick up the blue source, so you have double blue to cast a double blue card. You also, on turn 4, for example, if you're missing your land drop, get to play Sentinel, pick up a land, play a 2-drop. And then one other card that I think is sort of interesting to talk about, just I've had this decision once in a while, is whether or not to run out your Sunshower Druid on turn 1. Sunshower Druid being the 1 mana O2 that puts a counter on something and gains a life when it enters. And it really just depends on what the other cards in your hand are. If your hand is pretty slow, you've got a bunch of expensive things, yeah, just play it. Maybe it pecks in for a point or two and it blocks. But if you have like a 2-drop into a 3-drop into a 4-drop, I often hold it so that I can put the Druid's counter on the 2-drop, so the 2-drop gets to attack on turn 3 or on turn 4. Just lets it be relevant for a little bit longer. Although, that changes if you have a lot of ways to blink the Druid, because you don't mind just playing it early and then blinking it later. So just really plan out your turns a few turns in advance when you're playing frogs. Think about what you're blinking. Think about what makes a better blocker. Think about, do you want to attack? Because there are a lot of draws in my frog decks that are just pretty good beatdown draws, right? So don't always think, okay, I'm trying to make this board stall. You might have Baker's Bane Duo into Sticky Tongue Sentinel into Lily Splash Mentor, and that's just a lot of power and toughness that you can just attack with. All right, and last deck we're going to talk about today is Blue-Black. And Blue-Black's a deck that I have drafted quite a bit in the past week. It's been a deck that I found to be pretty open. Black is my favorite color in the format at this point. I prefer to draft it just ever so slightly over green, so I start there a lot. And then blue is, I think, underdrafted relative to how good it is. Like I was talking about last week, how I don't really have any issues with blue. I don't treat it as that much worse than any of the other colors. I'm on board with a lot of other content creators that kind of have red as the worst color. So yeah, just by virtue of black being a place I start and blue being pretty open. And I think as I play more and more blue-black, I've realized that it is less controlling than blue-black might be in some other formats. And I've seen a lot of people try to build it as like a super controlling deck, a decent amount of removal, and maybe a few top-end cards. But I think unless you end up with a lot of removal, like 9, 10 removal spells, and then like a good mythic, or maybe Ren the Relentless is a good inevitability engine, I don't think it really has too many tools to be a great control deck. I think it ends up being a little more controlling mid-range, right? Where you're still playing to the board and you're generally trying to end the game by attacking and blocking. Maybe you do have a little more interaction than some other decks to keep people off balance. Maybe your early turns aren't playing a 2-drop into a 3-drop. It's a little more playing a Saver into a Nocturnal Hunger, and then you deploy your creatures. The more of the uncommons you have, like Persistent Marshstalker and Shoreline Looter and the gold uncommon Tidecaller Mentor, the 3/3 menace that bounces something if you have Threshold, more of that kind of stuff you have, the more you're actually more of an aggressive deck, I think, because those are just good ending the game kind of cards. Some specific cards here to talk about. Sugarcoat. This is the 2 in a blue aura. It's got flash. You can enchant a creature, and the enchanted creature is a food. Just a very small note on this card is you generally are going to want to cast this card after your opponent has already attacked, already turned their creature sideways, because especially relevant if you're in a racing situation, if you do that and you turn into a food, well, the food actually has to tap to sacrifice and gain 3 life. So I've actually been in quite a few spots where my opponents have kind of jumped the gun a little bit and cast the Sugarcoat before I made the attack, and that let me have that 3 life that I needed to survive an additional turn. And lastly, our card that I have been playing a little more often, just a little bit of a shout out here, Bandit's Talent. This is the 1 in a black class that when it enters, the opponent either discards 2 lands or discards a non-land card. Level up for a single black mana. If that player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, they lose 2 life. 4 mana, level up to level 3. At the beginning of your draw step, you draw an additional card for each opponent who has 1 or fewer cards in hand. So this is a card that isn't just good. Like, you don't just want to put this in any deck. But once you have, I would say, like 2 or 3 other cards that make your opponents discard cards, for example, Ruthless Negotiation or Thoughtstalker Warlock, I think it becomes a real card. I think it even becomes a good card. This is a little bit more of a controlling card than an aggressive card. You kind of want to be able to stall at the board, so you don't mind casting this 2 mana discard spell, leveling it up and leveling it up again. But I actually think that if you do end up in the spot where you didn't end up with great ways to close the game, or you're not the aggressive version of blue-black with the good uncommon attacking creatures, I think this is a pretty good inevitability engine. I've even played Psychic Whirl, which is the discard spell, like the Mind Rot, 3 mana, the opponent discards 2 cards, and if you control a rat, you surveil 2. I've even played that card when I've got a Bandit's Talent, and I don't have that much other discard. And that's gonna do it for today's episode. I think if I'm to boil down a lot of what we talked about today, it's just making sure that in-game, you're being vigilant, you're being an observant player. You're not just autopiloting, which is the downfall of Magic players everywhere, just turning on autopilot. But what I mean by that is making sure that you're, again, observing the matchup, figuring out, okay, thinking actively, what am I supposed to do in this matchup? What's my role? What are my goals? As the game goes on, thinking about the cards that you want to draw to actually close out the game or survive, perhaps. The thing we talked about today is super evolutionary. I've talked about a lot of this stuff on previous gameplay episodes, but because Bloomburrow is a little bit more straightforward, a little more predictable, it's a great training ground, I think, for getting good at gameplay. Anyways, thank you so much for watching and listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe, give a like, really helps with the channel. Like I mentioned, I do have a guest coming on next week. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.